Is elevated LDL cholesterol genuinely something to fear, or has this become one of the most misunderstood topics in modern health discussions? Countless people have been raising this exact question, wondering whether decades of medical guidance have gotten it wrong. For me, this subject carries a personal weight. Someone very close to me experienced a serious cardiac event many years back, and looking back, the guidance given at the time left a lot to be desired. So what follows isn't about defending a camp or chasing a trend. It's about sorting through the noise and figuring out, as honestly as possible, what the evidence actually tells us about heart attacks, strokes, and the choices that shape how long and how well we live. I'm a physician who has spent years working in emergency care, and I've watched firsthand what happens when conditions that could have been prevented simply weren't. My goal here isn't to lecture you, but to walk you through this like a fair-minded review, presenting the strongest arguments on both sides. We'll start with the case for LDL and its carrier protein playing a direct role in cardiovascular disease. Then we'll look honestly at the strongest counterarguments, the studies people point to when they claim there's no real connection, or that higher levels might even be beneficial. I'll try to be fair about where those arguments have merit and where they fall apart. We'll also touch on the influence of pharmaceutical companies, since that comes up constantly, and whether that undermines the science or not. We'll look at what cholesterol levels tend to look like among the world's longest living populations. And by the end, I'll share where I personally land, but only after we've gone through everything methodically. Let's start with the basics. Cholesterol travels through your bloodstream inside small transport particles, and those particles carry a marker protein on their surface. Each particle carries exactly one of these markers, so measuring that protein essentially tells you how many particles are circulating in your system. This matters enormously because when it comes to plaque buildup in your arteries, what drives the underlying biology isn't simply how much cholesterol exists, but how many individual particles are available to become lodged in the artery wall. This distinction is where a lot of confusion originates. The standard test, most people get measures an estimate of how much cholesterol sits inside these particles, but it's an imperfect stand-in for the actual particle count, especially for certain metabolic profiles. Someone might show a fairly normal reading on the standard test while still carrying a high number of particles if those particles happen to be smaller and more numerous. This is exactly why many clinicians now favor measuring the particle marker directly, because it removes the guesswork. Some people take the fact that the standard measurement is imperfect and conclude that the entire idea of these particles contributing to heart disease must be flawed. That's a bit like arguing that because your car's fuel gauge occasionally misreads, fuel itself doesn't matter for the engine. The underlying mechanism is still there. The real question we need to answer is whether having more of these particles circulating over years and decades raises your risk of developing artery clogging plaques that eventually cause heart attacks and strokes. Before going further, I want to be upfront. No one is sponsoring this discussion, and I have no financial stake in which conclusion you reach. My only interest is figuring out what genuinely gives people the best shot at a long, healthy life, and I'm open to being wrong if the evidence points elsewhere. So what would it actually take to prove that these particles cause disease rather than simply correlate with it? Medicine relies on several markers to help sort real causal relationships from coincidence. First, does the underlying biology make sense? Is there a plausible pathway from particle exposure to arterial damage? Second, do populations with higher levels show more disease overall? Third, when you lower these levels through intervention, do cardiac events actually decrease? Fourth, if someone's genetics naturally keep these levels low from birth, is their lifetime risk also lower? And fifth, does the benefit scale with how much you reduce these levels? When several of these lines of evidence converge, the case for causation becomes much stronger. Now let's look at what has convinced most specialists in this field. This isn't built on a single paper or a single company's trial. It rests on multiple independent pillars. The first pillar comes from control trials. Researchers take large groups, randomly assign half to a treatment that lowers these particles and half to a placebo, then track outcomes for years. A massive analysis pooling data from over 170,000 participants across many statin trials found that for every unit reduction in this cholesterol marker, there's roughly a 1/5 reduction in major cardiac events, heart attacks, strokes, and procedures to reopen blocked arteries. This pattern holds in people who've never had a cardiac event and in those who've already had one, in men and women, in diabetics and non-diabetics, and it scales with how much the levels were lowered. Beyond statins, newer drug classes tell the same story. One major trial testing a different class of cholesterol-lowering medication on top of standard therapy. In people with established heart disease, lowered particle levels by more than half and significantly reduced cardiac events compared to placebo. A second trial using a different drug from the same class, tested in people who'd recently suffered an acute cardiac event, produced the same result. The fact that two separate drugs working through completely different mechanisms both showed benefit rules out the idea that this is some quirk unique to one molecule. Yet another medication class, one that blocks cholesterol absorption in the gut entirely, was added to standard therapy in a large trial and again produced a modest but statistically significant reduction in cardiac events over 7 years. What ties all of this together is the dose-response relationship. Regardless of which mechanism you use, statins, absorption blockers, or newer injectable therapies, the more you lower these particle levels, the more you reduce cardiac events. This kind of consistency across multiple unrelated mechanisms is one of the strongest signals of genuine causation. The second pillar comes from genetics. Randomized trials only run for a few years and typically start once someone is already middle-aged. But some people are born with gene variants that naturally keep their particle levels low for their entire lives, essentially functioning as nature's own lifelong trial. Large genetic studies involving hundreds of thousands of people consistently show that lifelong lower exposure to these particles corresponds to substantially lower lifetime cardiovascular risk, and the effect size is often larger than what shows up in medication trials, which makes sense given the decades of exposure difference. Comparisons between genes that lower triglycerides versus genes that lower the particle marker directly show that cardiovascular benefit tracks specifically with the particle count, not with triglycerides. This supports the idea that particle number, not just cholesterol content, is what drives arterial damage. The third pillar comes from broad statistical analyses comparing outcomes across many different drug classes, old and new, and asking whether the degree of cardiac risk reduction lines up with the degree of particle lowering. The relationship holds remarkably consistently. If 5 entirely different mechanisms all produce the same dose-response curve, the simplest explanation is that lowering the particle count itself is what drives the benefit. Now let's turn to the skeptical side and give it a fair hearing. One frequently cited argument points to studies in older populations showing no clear link between cholesterol levels and overall mortality, or even an inverse relationship where higher levels correlate with living longer. At face value, that sounds like a serious challenge. But there's an important distinction between dying from any cause and dying specifically from artery disease. As people age, they're more likely to die from unrelated illnesses, cancer, infections, frailty, and those competing causes muddy observational data. There's also a well-documented phenomenon called reverse causation, where underlying illness causes cholesterol levels to drop rather than the other way around. Someone who's frail, malnourished, or already seriously ill often sees their levels fall as a consequence of their condition, not as a protective feature. A large cohort study found a U-shaped curve where both very low and very high levels correlated with higher mortality, but the authors themselves pointed to reverse causation as the likely explanation for the low end, and that inverse relationship largely disappeared once chronically ill or recently weight-losing individuals were excluded from the analysis. Similar critiques apply to older data, suggesting cholesterol stops predicting mortality after a certain age. That conclusion ignores the fact that decades of arterial damage have often already accumulated by that point, and it doesn't account for the same reverse causation issue. Another common argument is that roughly half of heart attacks occur in people with cholesterol levels considered normal. This sounds compelling until you remember that cardiovascular risk is probabilistic, not deterministic. Smoking doesn't cause every case of lung cancer, but it dramatically raises the odds. The same logic applies here. These particles are one of several major risk factors, alongside blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, family history, and age. Reference ranges for these tests are often built around population averages rather than what's biologically optimal. And in a population where cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death, an average reading isn't the same thing as a safe one. Plaque accumulates over decades, so a single snapshot reading at the time of a heart attack doesn't capture someone's cumulative lifetime exposure, which is really what matters. There's also a popular argument that it's specifically the oxidized form of these particles that causes harm, as if that lets the raw particle count off the hook. There's truth to the oxidation mechanism. Damaged particles trapped in the artery wall do trigger inflammatory responses that build plaque, but you can't oxidize particles that aren't circulating in the first place. More particles floating around means more raw material available for that oxidative process. Genetic studies bear this out. People with a lifelong lower particle count don't have some special protection against oxidation. They simply have fewer particles available to get trapped and damaged in the first place. A related claim, especially common among people following very low carbohydrate diets, is that particle size matters more than particle count, and that certain diets produce larger, supposedly more benign particles. There is some evidence that smaller, denser particles are somewhat more prone to penetrating artery walls. But once you control for total particle count, the additional predictive value of particle size shrinks dramatically or disappears. Picture trying to reduce your odds of being struck by a vehicle. Smaller cars might be marginally riskier individually, but if the road is flooded with plenty of larger vehicles instead, you're still at high risk overall. Total volume is what matters most, and that's exactly why measuring particle count directly tends to be more informative than fixating on particle size. Then there's the coronary calcium scan argument, the idea that a 0 score means these levels don't matter. Calcium scoring is a genuinely useful tool for understanding existing plaque burden, but it only captures calcified plaque that is already formed. It doesn't capture soft, non-calcified plaque, and it says nothing about future accumulation. A young person with elevated particle levels might show a clean scan simply because plaque hasn't had time to calcify yet, but if that exposure continues for another 2 or 3 decades, the damage accumulates regardless of today's clean scan. The two markers are complementary tools, not substitutes for one another. A more philosophically interesting argument suggests that these particles are found at sites of arterial injury because they're part of a repair process responding to damage rather than causing it. Much like firefighters showing up at a fire doesn't mean firefighters caused it. It's a clever hypothesis, but it collapses under the genetic evidence. If these particles were simply passive repair agents, then having fewer of them from birth shouldn't reduce cardiovascular risk. But it does dramatically. People with gene variants producing lifelong lower particle counts aren't more prone to arterial injury. They're protected from it. Removing firefighters from a real fire makes things worse. Removing these particles from the bloodstream consistently makes cardiovascular outcomes better across every study design we have. It's also worth remembering how early this process actually begins. Autopsy studies on younger people who died from unrelated trauma have found early fatty streaks and developing plaques already present in a striking number of teenagers and young adults, and the extent of those changes correlated with known risk factors, including elevated cholesterol. This tells us that arterial disease isn't something that suddenly appears in your 50s. It's a slow process that can quietly progress for decades before any symptoms show up, which is exactly why lifetime cumulative exposure matters so much more than a single snapshot reading taken later in life. There's also considerable debate around very low carbohydrate diets, since a meaningful subset of people see substantial increases in these particle levels on such diets. Some researchers have proposed that in lean, metabolically healthy individuals, this rise might reflect increased fat trafficking for energy rather than harmful accumulation, and that it may not carry the same risk profile. This is a genuinely interesting area worth continued study, but we don't yet have long-term outcome data confirming that this pattern is safe. Until such evidence exists, the more cautious approach is to treat a substantial rise in these particle levels as worth addressing, whether through adjusting the types of fat consumed, increasing fiber intake, or reconsidering the overall dietary approach, rather than dismissing it because someone feels fine in the short term. On the subject of pharmaceutical influence, it's a fair and healthy concern. Drug companies do fund trials, and financial relationships between researchers and industry are real and worth scrutinizing. But the case for these particles being causal doesn't rest on any single company or drug. Multiple unrelated medication classes, made by different manufacturers, all show the same benefit and the same dose-response relationship. Genetic studies, which involve no pharmaceutical funding whatsoever since gene variants are assigned at conception long before anyone develops a drug, show the same pattern. Independent academic groups conducting large pooled analyses across trial from different eras and different companies reach the same conclusion. You need to imagine a conspiracy spanning multiple continents, multiple unrelated companies, multiple decades, and human genetics itself, which simply isn't a plausible explanation. People also point to the world's longest living populations as a counterexample, but the data doesn't support that. Traditional diets in these regions tend to be lower in saturated fat and rich in vegetables, legumes, and whole grains, and average cholesterol levels among older residents in these areas tend to be lower than in typical Western populations. These regions aren't controlled experiments, and genetics, physical activity, social connection, and healthcare access all play a role too. So you can't isolate a single factor as the secret to their longevity. But it's telling that we don't find any long-lived population eating a diet that produces persistently high particle counts. If these particles were truly harmless, you'd expect at least one such example to exist, and we simply don't see it. Finally, some point out that even aggressive treatment doesn't eliminate cardiovascular risk entirely, arguing that if these particles are the main driver, lowering them should erase risk completely. But cardiovascular disease is multifactorial. Blood pressure, blood sugar, smoking, inflammation, and genetics all contribute independently. Lowering particle counts reduces risk substantially, but it doesn't reduce it to zero because other pathways to disease still exist. That doesn't diminish the importance of addressing particle levels. It just means it shouldn't be the only thing you address. So where does all of this leave us? After weighing both sides carefully, the overall weight of evidence, controlled trials, genetic studies, and consistent dose-response relationships across multiple independent mechanisms point strongly toward these particles playing a real, causal role in arterial disease. That doesn't mean everyone with elevated levels will suffer a cardiac event, or that everyone who has had elevated levels beforehand. Risk operates on a population level and remains probabilistic for any given individual, shaped by many overlapping factors. Practically speaking, if you're wondering what to do with this information, consider getting the direct particle marker tested rather than relying solely on the standard panel, since it offers a clearer picture of your actual risk. Address the full picture of cardiovascular health together: blood pressure, blood sugar, physical activity, sleep, and stress, rather than fixating on one number in isolation. If a dietary change causes a substantial rise in your particle levels, treat that as useful feedback rather than something to ignore simply because you feel well in the moment. And if your levels remain persistently elevated despite lifestyle adjustments, have an open conversation with your doctor about whether medication might be appropriate for your individual risk profile. These decisions are best made with real data and a trusted physician who understands your full health picture, not through arguments online. The debate itself is healthy. Questioning evidence and demanding rigor is exactly how medicine improves over time. But eventually, the conversation needs to translate into action. If you're uncertain about your own risk, the answer isn't more debate. It's getting tested, tracking your numbers over time, and making informed decisions alongside a doctor you trust. Everyone's biology responds differently. Some people can maintain low particle counts on almost any diet, others can't, and the only way to know where you stand is to actually measure it and act on what you find.